From time to time in this course, I have mentioned virtues or vices that do not have a name, at least not a name in English. And I also mentioned virtues and vices that Aristotle said had no name in Greek. I want to talk about why we would think that these no-name virtues or vices exist, and that relates to the question of how we identify virtues and vices in the first place. Let's start with 3 different ways to make a list of virtues. The simplest way is to list commonly used words for virtues in our own language at the time we live. If we made that list today in the U.S., I assume that honesty, courage, justice, generosity, compassion, perseverance, and others would be on the list. The advantage of this approach is that we trust the development of our language and the thoughts it expresses, at least up to a point, so the fact that there is a name for a virtue is some reason to think it exists. But we know that sometimes words are lost or change their meaning, and new ones are added. For instance, I think that the word temperance has lost its original meaning. Does that mean that temperance in the original sense is not a virtue? We have also added words. Open-mindedness was not on any standard list of virtues until the modern era, and nobody had heard of the vice of racism. I doubt that we would think that racism wasn't a vice until it acquired a name. What about virtues that have names in other languages and other cultures? Alistair MacIntyre mentions a virtue that the Lakota tribe call Wankentagnaka, a virtue that cuts across justice and generosity. It is like generosity because it involves uncalculated giving, expressed in ceremonial acts. But it is like justice because someone who fails in it has failed to give what is owed to others. Maybe we have something like that in our expectations of gift giving at birthdays or Christmas or to a newly married couple. Giving a gift is an act of generosity, and it is appropriate for the recipient to be grateful. But if you don't give a gift when it is expected, it is a slight. If you don't give, you can expect not to receive gifts from that person in the future. The relationship changes for the worse. This might be an example of why we sometimes have to invent words, because it is very hard to express a thought without a term for it. If somebody was a guest at your wedding, but after a year they still have not given you a gift, what do you call that? Suppose you think that someone does not become angry when she should. You will have a hard time identifying the vice and communicating it to others because there isn't a commonly used word for it. Even if you notice the vice, other people may not because the lack of a word can make the vice invisible. I think then that even though our common vocabulary is a good place to start in making a list of virtues and vices, we can't rely upon it completely. A second way to identify virtues and vices is to connect virtue to a theoretical idea that supports the judgment that virtue is a human excellence. The virtues are the traits that are theoretically supported in that way. That leaves open the possibility that some of our commonly recognized virtues are mistaken, and that there are other virtues that we have not recognized. I said at the beginning of the course that the connection between virtue and human nature has a long history. Aristotle identified virtues partly by the first approach of listing commonly used Greek words for excellences, and partly by the connection between individual traits and what is fulfilling of human nature. Aristotle thought that a virtue is a mean between two extremes, an extreme of excess and an extreme of deficiency. So it didn't bother him that there are lots of virtues and vices without names. We conveniently have words for the mean in facing danger, courage, and a word for an excess of facing danger, foolhardiness or rashness, and a word for a deficiency in facing danger, cowardice. But think about all the other virtues we have discussed. We often do not have 2 vice words for every virtue. Disloyalty is a deficiency of loyalty. But is there such a thing as an excess of loyalty? We wouldn't call it an excess of loyalty, but an excess of whatever it is that loyalty is the right amount of. What about excessive humility or excessive perseverance or excessive compassion? What about the deficiencies? Is there such a thing as a deficiency in the desire for pleasure? I said in an earlier lecture that I think there is. And I also said that I think there can be a deficiency in the disposition to anger, but I don't know a word for it. I think then that paying attention to the way a virtue connects with a general view of a good human life or human nature is one way to critique our list of virtues. And that is an advantage of the second approach to making a list of virtues. But there is a third way to make a virtues list that I favor, and which I described in the lecture on the components of virtue. If a virtue is a human excellence, then it is an admirable trait of character. And how do we find out what is admirable? I think that the best way to do that is to look at the people we admire the most and examine them carefully to reveal what is admirable about them. We can often recognize someone as admirable before we can say what it is in them that makes them admirable. We may have no word or concept to attach to their admirability until we look at them more closely. Admiration comes first. The concept for what we admire comes second. So a good person is a person like that, and we point to Jesus or Socrates or Gandhi or Mother Teresa or your own grandmother. And the virtues are the traits we discover in these persons. This is the basic approach of the theory I call Exemplarist virtue theory. My colleague Amy Olberding has argued that the Confucian Analects exhibits this style of virtue theory. Confucius says virtue is what he sees in the exemplars of ages past, like the Duke of Zhou. Confucius's students see it in him. The Analects does not analyze the concept of any virtue, but displays it in the demeanor, words, and behavior of Confucius. I think that examining exemplars of admirability is the best way to identify virtues, and it is also the first step in moral education, a topic for a later lecture. Moral change, like the revolution in attitudes towards persons of other races, does not arise from analyzing the concept of justice, but from admiration for people like Martin Luther King, who stood for basic human respect no matter what a person's race. People changed their attitudes because they began to admire people who had an expansive attitude towards the dignity of all human beings, and they began to feel scorn for those who did not. Can the exemplarist approach allow us to identify virtues that are completely unlike the virtues we can identify by the other approaches? My student Ben Polonsky is writing a dissertation on a new virtue he calls moderation, or the virtue of restraining one's powers. Here is a story that shows why he thinks we need to invent a word for this virtue. A Japanese Go master of the last century used to ride the public trains incognito from match to match, playing games with amateurs to pass the time. It did not matter to him whom he was playing, whether they were strong or weak, beginners or experts. He always won, that is, every single game, by exactly 1/2 point. This is the slimmest margin it is possible to win by in a game where the discrepancy in points can be 350 points. His opponents never knew who it was they were playing, although master Go players were something like celebrities at this time in Japan. Polonsky says there is something about this man, something almost godlike about such mastery, superiority, dominance, and control, so quietly, so obscurely expressed. The Go master had to know his opponent better than the opponent knew himself. Having never played against the opponent before, the master needed to be able to anticipate which of all the points available to his opponent on the board the opponent would take of his own accord. He would need to be able to give the opponent points without his knowing he was being given them. The Go master did this even though what he was accustomed to doing with peers was making the strongest move available to him at every turn. I agree with Polanski that the Japanese Go Master displayed a virtue, and I do not know the name of it. Perhaps moderation is a good word for it. What is particularly interesting about it to me is that it is not just a modification of some other virtue or vice concept, like the virtue of proper ambition or the vice of excessive generosity. It is a very different virtue. We would not think of it by studying a list of ordinary words for virtue, and I don't think we would think of it by studying Aristotle's account of virtue. We think of it because we see it displayed in an especially admirable way. I would like to find out what you think the Go Master's virtue is, and whether you see it in other people. What vices are opposed to it? I hope that we will also talk about other virtues that you think have no name.